You find yourself standing in the opulent palace of Ajuda in Lisbon, 1887. The marble halls echo with whispered conversations, silk rustles against stone floors, and somewhere in the royal chambers, King Luís I of Portugal sits hunched over his desk, his once steady hands trembling as he tries to write a simple letter. The man who once translated Shakespeare's greatest works into Portuguese can barely form coherent sentences anymore. His headaches are so intense that even candlelight feels like daggers piercing his skull. This isn't the story of a king growing old gracefully. This is the story of a brilliant mind being slowly devoured from within by a disease that didn't care about royal blood divine right or the fate of empires. Luís contracted syphilis sometime in the 1880s, and by 1887 it had progressed to neurosyphilis, a stage where the bacteria literally eat holes in your brain tissue. But Luís wasn't unique. Behind the golden facades and royal portraits of European courts, a silent killer was stalking the most powerful bloodlines in the world. Syphilis crept through palace walls like a curse, rotting empires from within, shattering minds, destroying dynasties, and leaving behind secrets that royal families would kill to keep hidden. Today we're diving into the cursed chambers where 5 different royal bloodlines encountered this medical nightmare. Because when you combine absolute power with unlimited sexual access and a disease that was poorly understood and completely incurable, you don't just get personal tragedy, you get political disasters that reshape the map of Europe. These aren't just medical case studies. These are stories of how a bacterial infection could topple dynasties and bloodlines and drive crown princes to murder-suicide. The disease that medical texts coldly call treponema pallidum became the hidden architect of European history, working its destruction one royal bedroom at a time. Before we enter these cursed chambers of medical horror, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you hearing this story? I love knowing our community spans every corner of the globe, all of us drawn to those moments when the official histories hide far darker truths lurking in the shadows of power. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where we learn that royal blood proves no protection against the microscopic enemies that can destroy empires from within. 5. Joseph III, Holy Roman Emperor. The Habsburg Tragedy. Let's start with what appeared to be a simple case of royal excess in early 18th century Austria. Joseph I was everything you'd expect from a Habsburg heir, intelligent, cultured, and surrounded by the finest luxuries Europe could offer. Born in 1678, he was raised with the expectation that he would inherit one of the most powerful thrones in Europe, and he embraced that destiny with enthusiasm. Joseph loved the finer things in life. He threw elaborate parties, surrounded himself with progressive thinkers, and developed what court observers diplomatically called an appreciation for feminine company. When his mother, Empress Eleanor, decided he needed to settle down at age 21, she arranged his marriage to Wilhelmina Amalia of Brunswick-Lüneburg, a serious and devout woman, 5 years his senior. The wedding was a magnificent spectacle, as Habsburg weddings always were. At first, the couple seemed happy enough. Wilhelmina was medically examined before the marriage to ensure her fertility, a chilling reminder that royal women were expected to produce heirs, not necessarily find love. She did her duty admirably, giving birth to 3 children, including a crucial male heir named Leopold. But there was a problem brewing beneath the surface of this apparently successful royal marriage. Joseph quickly grew bored with monogamy, as many powerful men do when faced with unlimited options and no real consequences for their actions. Every hunting trip became an opportunity for what his close friend Count Lambert provided access to young peasant girls for the emperor's pleasure. The court began to whisper about Joseph's increasingly bold affairs. Noble ladies were eager to share the emperor's bed, and one of them, Countess Marianne Palffy, became his official mistress, a title that was unheard of in conservative Austria. The scandal shook the court so severely that even the Pope complained about the emperor's conduct. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Joseph's infant son, Leopold, died before his first birthday, struck down by what court physicians called hydrocephalus, water on the brain. Modern medical analysis suggests this might have been congenital syphilis, but at the time, no one understood the connection between parental infections and infant mortality. Suddenly, it became urgent for Joseph and Wilhelmina to produce another healthy male heir. The future of the Habsburg dynasty depended on it, but Joseph's carelessness was about to make that impossible in ways the court couldn't have imagined. For John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, the Restoration Rake. While Joseph was learning the dangers of imperial excess, let's travel to Restoration England and meet the original bad boy of the aristocracy. John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, was born in 1647 into a family of war heroes. His father had served King Charles I loyally, and when young John inherited his title at just 11 years old, King Charles II took him under his wing. This royal mentorship proved to be either a blessing or a curse, depending on your perspective. By age 13, John was already at Oxford, where he was reportedly growing debauched, according to university records. After graduation, he toured Europe soaking in Enlightenment philosophy and likely contracting more than just new ideas about literature and politics. Back in England, the king encouraged him to court Elizabeth Mallet, a wealthy and beautiful heiress. She liked him well enough, but her family had reservations about his reputation. So John and his mother did something that shocked even Restoration Society. They abducted her. Elizabeth was rescued. John was thrown into the Tower of London. And what should have been a simple courtship became a scandal that entertained London society for months. Eventually, John redeemed himself by fighting heroically in the Second Dutch War. He returned as a war hero. Elizabeth was won over, and they married in what seemed like a fairy tale ending. They had 4 children together, and for a brief moment it appeared that John Wilmot might settle into respectable married life. But the moment John returned to London, he forgot his family and rejoined what was known as the Merry Gang, a group of nobles whose primary occupation was pursuing pleasure in all its forms. He began a long affair with actress Nell Gwynn, who later became King Charles II's mistress. He helped launch the career of Elizabeth Barry, another actress who became both his mistress and the mother of his illegitimate child. John's behavior grew increasingly erratic and dangerous. When Elizabeth Barry's fame grew beyond his influence, he turned bitter and abandoned her. He wrote brilliant, biting satire that skewered London society, but when he mocked the king's sexual obsessions in a play performed before the court, he was banished from London entirely. This is where John's story becomes truly disturbing. He rebranded himself as Dr. Bendo and toured London disguised as a quack fertility doctor. Sometimes he even appeared as Mrs. Bendo, which allowed him to examine young wives in private. Many of these women did become pregnant, likely by him, in what amounted to systematic sexual predation, disguised as medical practice. But by his early 30s, something was clearly wrong with the Earl of Rochester. Court observers noted changes in his appearance and behavior that went beyond normal aging or dissolute living. 3 Abbasid of Persia. The Safavid decline. Let's travel east to the Safavid Empire, where a similar pattern was playing out, with even more devastating consequences for an entire civilization. Abbas Attan inherited the throne of Persia in 1632 at just 9 years old, but he was no puppet ruler. By 15, he had kicked out his father's Grand Vizier and taken full control of one of the world's most powerful empires. Initially, Abbas ruled with remarkable wisdom for someone so young. He avoided costly wars with the Ottoman Empire, scored significant military victories against the Mughals and Russians, and became known throughout the region for his fairness and religious tolerance. Under his rule, the Persian people enjoyed a rare era of peace and prosperity. But Abbas had developed what court chroniclers euphemistically called an enthusiasm for the pleasures of life. His parties were legendary throughout the Islamic world, elaborate affairs filled with music, dancing, and flowing wine served in golden cups inlaid with precious stones. He even had a special drinking vessel, a gift from the Tsar of Russia, that was considered one of the wonders of the age. As the empire's economic problems mounted in the 1650s, Abbas threw himself deeper into these private pleasures. His wild parties grew more intense and frequent. After particularly debauched nights, he would disappear from public life for weeks, leaving crucial state business unattended while he recovered from what court physicians called exhaustion. Abbas maintained a massive harem of concubines, many of them enslaved women, taken from lands the empire had conquered. The exact number isn't recorded, but contemporary accounts suggest it numbered in the hundreds. It's unclear exactly how or when Abbas contracted syphilis, but Court records from the 1660s begin to document concerning changes in the Shah's health and behavior. By 1666, Abbas was falling apart. At just 34 years old, he was experiencing what Persian court physicians described as a wasting disease that affects both body and mind. Some historians suspect that his harem may have also been infected, creating a medical crisis that the court worked desperately to hide from rival empires who might see Persian weakness as an opportunity for invasion. The once vibrant ruler who had brought his empire to new heights of power and culture was now struggling with what modern medical analysis recognizes as late-stage syphilis. His body and mind were breaking down simultaneously, and there was nothing Persian medicine could do to help him. To Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria-Hungary. The murder-suicide. Now we come to perhaps the most shocking case in our investigation, because this is where we realize that royal syphilis wasn't just about individual suffering, it was reshaping the political map of Europe in ways that would echo through 2 world wars. Crown Prince Rudolf was born in 1858 as the son of Emperor Franz Joseph III and the beloved Empress Elizabeth. He was expected to inherit one of Europe's most powerful thrones and continue the Habsburg dynasty's dominance. But what he inherited instead was trauma, instability, and eventually a disease that would drive him to murder. Rudolf was torn from his sister Gisela at age 6 and raised by an abusive tutor who believed that royal children needed to be hardened through systematic cruelty. He grew into a man marked by psychological instability, heavy drinking, and what court observers called risky romantic entanglements. At 23, he was married off to Princess Stephanie of Belgium, who was 17 at the time. But even during their courtship, Rudolf brought his current mistress to the introduction ceremony, a deliberate insult that should have warned everyone about his capacity for cruelty. After their daughter was born, Rudolf grew cold toward his wife and increasingly reckless in his behavior. Then came the medical disaster that would destroy multiple lives. Rudolf contracted both gonorrhea and syphilis, and he passed both infections to Stephanie without telling her what was happening. Stephanie didn't know what was wrong with her. Court physicians told her she was suffering from stomach flu and feminine hysteria. The real result was that the infections destroyed her fallopian tubes, making it impossible for her ever to have another child. When she finally learned the truth, she was furious and betrayed beyond repair. So let me pause here and make sure we understand what we've uncovered in these royal chambers. We have an emperor who infected his wife and destroyed the Habsburg succession while his brain was being eaten by syphilis. We have an English earl who used medical disguises to sexually assault young wives throughout London. We have a Persian Shah whose disease-induced decline led to the collapse of one of the world's great empires. And we have a crown prince who was driven to murder-suicide by the psychological effects of advanced syphilis. This isn't just medical history anymore. This is realizing that some of the most consequential political disasters in European history were caused by rulers whose judgment was being systematically destroyed by untreated sexually transmitted infections. The royal chambers weren't just cursed by politics or supernatural forces, they were literally infected with bacteria that rewrote the fate of nations. Let's return to Crown Prince Rudolf's story, because this is where we see the full horror of what syphilis could do to a royal mind. After infecting his wife and destroying their marriage, Rudolf fell into a psychological spiral that court physicians couldn't understand or treat. He began begging various women to die with him in what he called romantic death pacts. His mistress Mitzi Casper was the first to refuse and went to the police, but no one believed that the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was planning suicide. The authorities dismissed her concerns as the dramatic fantasies of a hysterical woman. Desperate and increasingly unhinged, Rudolf turned to a 17-year-old noble girl, Baroness Mary Wetzera, who was infatuated with him. She represented everything his syphilis-damaged mind was seeking: youth, beauty, and the naive romantic idealism that would make her willing to die for love. On January 30th, 1889, they were found dead at Mayerling Lodge. Mary had been shot in the head. Rudolf died by suicide hours later. The scene was so shocking that Habsburg authorities immediately began covering up the details. Mary's body was secretly propped up in a carriage with a broomstick to make her appear alive, then buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field. Official reports claimed Rudolph died of an aneurysm to preserve the family's honor, but everyone at court knew the truth. The heir to one of Europe's most powerful empires had been driven to murder-suicide by a disease that was systematically destroying his brain tissue. The Mayerling incident wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political earthquake that destabilized the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire and contributed to the tensions that would eventually explode into World War I. When Luís of Portugal, the Scholar King's decline, our most devastating case, brings us back to where we started, the royal chambers of Portugal, where King Luís XIII was slowly dying from neurosyphilis while his court pretended nothing was wrong. Luís was born in 1838 as the second son of Queen Maria II, never meant to rule. His older brother Pedro was crowned king at 16 after their mother died in childbirth, leaving Luís with all the luxury and none of the responsibility. It was a dream life for a young royal who preferred books to politics. Luís buried himself in literature, learning multiple languages and developing such a passion for Shakespeare that he translated many of the bard's plays into Portuguese. But Luís wasn't just a scholarly bookworm. He was also a smooth-talking charmer who used his linguistic talents and royal status to seduce countless women throughout Europe. Life was perfect for the playboy Prince of Portugal. But then disaster struck the Braganza dynasty like a medical apocalypse. In 1861, a deadly outbreak, possibly typhoid or cholera, swept through the royal family, killing not only Luís's elder brother Pedro V, but also his younger brothers Fernando and João. Just like that, Luís became king, and suddenly the Braganza dynasty needed heirs fast. Luís wrote desperate letters to Queen Victoria of England and King Leopold III of Belgium, begging for advice on finding a suitable wife. Both recommended Maria Theresa of Austria, but her father refused the match because she was only 16. Instead, Luís married Maria Pia of Savoy, the 14-year-old daughter of the King of Italy. Maria Pia was initially smitten with her husband. He was handsome, artistic, and intelligent, everything a young princess could want in a royal spouse. By the time she turned 18, she had already given birth to 2 sons and fully embraced her role as a devoted mother and queen. But behind closed doors, the marriage was disintegrating. Maria Pia's fairy tale began to crumble when she realized she wasn't the only woman in Luís's life. He was still pursuing other lovers, especially a popular actress named Rosa de Lima. The queen, heartbroken and furious, began taking long trips abroad, and court rumors suggested she may have had her own secret affairs and revenge. At some point in this tangled web of royal infidelity, Luís contracted syphilis. The exact timing isn't clear from court records, but what is certain is that by the mid-1880s, the disease had progressed to its most terrifying stage. In 1887, syphilis came roaring back into Luís's life with a vengeance, and it hit with the full force of neurosyphilis, a stage where the bacteria cross the blood-brain barrier and begin literally eating holes in brain tissue. The symptoms were a medical nightmare that court physicians couldn't explain or treat. Luís developed severe depression that lasted for months, violent mood swings that made him impossible to be around, and headaches so intense that he couldn't tolerate light or sound. He began experiencing seizures during important political meetings, and his mental capacity, once sharp enough to translate complex literary works, began deteriorating rapidly. The once charming scholar king was becoming a shadow of himself. Court observers noted that he could no longer concentrate long enough to read simple documents, let alone manage the complex political challenges facing Portugal. His handwriting became shaky and illegible. He would forget the names of close advisors he had known for years. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Luís was experiencing what modern medicine calls syphilitic psychosis delusions, paranoia, and violent rages that made him dangerous to be around. Court records from this period, carefully coded to hide the king's condition, describe incidents where Luís would fly into uncontrollable fury over minor perceived slights, accusing loyal servants of conspiracy and threatening violence against anyone who contradicted him. The Portuguese court worked desperately to hide the king's deteriorating condition from foreign powers who might see weakness as an opportunity for territorial expansion. They developed elaborate protocols for managing royal audiences, ensuring that Luís was only seen by foreign diplomats when he was having what physicians called lucid intervals. But by 1889, even these desperate measures couldn't hide the truth anymore. Luís died at just 50 years old after years of silent suffering that the Portuguese royal family would never publicly acknowledge. The official cause of death was listed as a sudden illness, but court physicians knew they had watched a brilliant mind being slowly consumed by bacteria that had turned the king's own brain against him. The death of Crown Prince Rudolf at Mayerling wasn't just the end of one tortured royal life, it was the beginning of the end for the entire Habsburg dynasty. Rudolf's murder-suicide driven by syphilis-induced psychosis created a succession crisis that would have consequences lasting well into the 20th century. With Rudolf dead and his marriage to Stephanie having produced only a daughter, the Habsburg succession fell to Franz Ferdinand Rudolf's cousin. Franz Ferdinand had never been prepared to rule and was considered politically moderate compared to the militaristic Rudolf. His assassination in Sarajevo in 1914 wouldn't just trigger World War I, it would complete the destruction that began in Rudolf's syphilis-infected brain. But the Habsburg case reveals something even more disturbing about royal syphilis, the systematic cover-ups that allowed the disease to spread through multiple generations. Emperor Joseph I's infection of his wife Wilhelmina had already weakened the Habsburg bloodline. In the early 1700s, the congenital syphilis that likely killed his infant son Leopold created genetic vulnerabilities that persisted through centuries of careful royal intermarriage designed to hide medical family secrets. Modern medical analysis of Habsburg by family portraits reveals the physical signs of congenital syphilis that court painters tried to disguise or minimize, the facial deformities, the stunted growth, the neurological problems that were passed down through generations of infected royal parents. The famous Habsburg jaw, long attributed to inbreeding, may actually have been a symptom of inherited syphilis that the family desperately tried to hide behind claims of noble genetic purity. The Earl of Rochester's death in 1680 demonstrates how quickly syphilis could destroy even the most brilliant minds. By 33, the disease had literally rotted away, his nose destroyed his vision, and left him blind, incontinent, and mentally shattered. But Rochester's case also reveals the predatory behavior that syphilis-infected nobles used to spread the disease as disguises as. Dr. Bendo allowed him to assault dozens of young wives while their husbands believed they were receiving medical treatment. Abbas Tahu's collapse in 1666 marked the beginning of the Safavid Empire's decline from regional superpower to political irrelevance. His syphilis-induced neglect of state business during crucial years allowed the Ottoman Empire to gain strategic advantages that Persia never recovered. The disease that destroyed Abbas's judgment ultimately helped reshape the balance of power in the Islamic world for centuries. These weren't isolated medical tragedies, they were the hidden engines of European political transformation. Syphilis didn't just kill individual royals, it toppled dynasties, ended bloodlines, and created power vacuums that rival nations exploited for territorial gain. The most chilling realization is that medieval and early modern royal families created perfect conditions for syphilis to literally rewrite world history. Unlimited sexual access combined with primitive medical understanding and absolute secrecy requirements meant that infected rulers could make empire-destroying decisions while experiencing bacterial-induced insanity, and no one could stop them or even acknowledge what was happening. The consequences of royal syphilis didn't end with the deaths of infected monarchs, they echoed through generations in ways that European royal families are still trying to hide. Congenital syphilis passed from infected parents to their children created genetic weaknesses that persisted through centuries of carefully arranged marriages designed to conceal medical family secrets. Consider the Habsburg dynasty's centuries-long struggle with what they called family constitutional weaknesses. Modern medical analysis suggests that many of the physical and mental disabilities that plagued Habsburg royals through multiple generations weren't the result of inbreeding. Alone, they were symptoms of congenital syphilis that had been passed down through infected royal bloodlines since Joseph I's time. The famous portraits of later Habsburg monarchs show the telltale signs that court painters tried to minimize the facial asymmetries, the neurological problems, the developmental disorders that royal physicians couldn't explain. What they attributed to noble blood and genetic purity was actually the inherited damage from sexually transmitted infections that their ancestors had spread through palace bedchambers. The Portuguese royal family's medical records, hidden in state archives for over a century, reveals similar patterns. Luís I's children and grandchildren experienced unusually high rates of mental illness, seizure disorders, and early death, all symptoms consistent with congenital syphilis affecting multiple generations. But perhaps most disturbing is the realization that royal marriage negotiations throughout the 18th and 19th centuries involved elaborate medical deceptions designed to hide evidence of family syphilis. Young princesses were subjected to invasive medical examinations, not just to verify their virginity, but to check for signs of inherited venereal disease that might contaminate rival bloodlines. The Earl of Rochester's predatory behavior as Dr. Bendo represents an even darker legacy: the ways that syphilis-infected nobles weaponized their disease to assault and infect commoners. His disguised medical practice allowed him to spread syphilis throughout London's merchant class while their husbands paid him for fertility treatments. The social consequences rippled outward for generations as infected families passed the disease to their children without understanding why their bloodlines were cursed with madness and early death. The intersection of political power, sexual secrecy, and hidden medical conditions didn't end with the invention of penicillin. Modern political leaders still struggle with the same fundamental tension between public transparency and private medical information that drove royal families to such desperate cover-ups. When we examine contemporary political scandals involving powerful figures' sexual behavior, we're seeing echoes of the same patterns that destroyed Rudolf Louis and Joseph. The combination of unlimited access, poor judgment, and potential health consequences continues to topple political careers and reshape international relations. The most important lesson from these royal medical disasters is understanding how untreated diseases can affect political decision-making. When Crown Prince Rudolf was making crucial diplomatic decisions during his final years, his judgment was being systematically impaired by bacterial infections, literally eating holes in his brain tissue. Modern voters deserve to know whether their leaders' medical conditions might be affecting their capacity to govern effectively. The systematic cover-ups that protected royal families' medical secrets also created a culture of institutional secrecy that persists in modern governments. The same logic that prevented Habsburg court physicians from honestly treating Joseph III's syphilis, that admitting weakness would invite enemy attack, still influences how political leaders approach transparency about their health conditions. But perhaps the most chilling modern parallel is recognizing how sexual predators continue to use positions of power to exploit vulnerable people, just as the Earl of Rochester used his medical disguises to assault young wives throughout London. The systematic nature of his predatory behavior, protected by his aristocratic status and social connections, mirrors contemporary scandals involving powerful figures who weaponize their authority to commit sexual assault. The royal family's desperate attempts to hide evidence of syphilis through arranged marriages and medical deceptions also illuminate how institutional power protects itself through systematic lying. When entire court systems were organized around concealing the truth about royal health conditions, it created precedents for government secrecy that continue to influence how political institutions handle inconvenient medical or personal information about their leaders. The real curse of these royal chambers wasn't supernatural. It was the toxic combination of absolute power and zero accountability that allowed diseased minds to make world-changing decisions without any mechanism for intervention or correction. When Luís I was experiencing syphilitic psychosis in the 1880s, no one in the Portuguese government had the authority to declare him unfit to rule, even as his delusions and violent rages were affecting crucial diplomatic negotiations. The same divine right of kings that gave him unlimited sexual access also prevented anyone from protecting the Portuguese people from the consequences of his bacterial-induced insanity. Crown Prince Rudolf's murder-suicide at Mayerling wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was the inevitable result of a system that gave unlimited power to a man whose capacity for rational judgment was being systematically destroyed by untreated disease. The Habsburg court's determination to hide his condition meant that no one could intervene, as his syphilis-induced paranoia and depression drove him toward violence. The most disturbing realization is that these royal families didn't accidentally create conditions that allowed syphilis to reshape European history. They deliberately chose secrecy and denial over effective medical treatment because they believed protecting their political power was more important than protecting their people from the consequences of diseased royal judgment. Emperor Joseph III could have sought effective treatment for his syphilis and avoided infecting his wife, but doing so would have required admitting weakness that might invite enemy invasion. Abbas II could have acknowledged his condition and appointed regents to handle state business during his illness. But Persian political culture required the Shah to appear divinely invincible at all times. These weren't just individual medical tragedies, they were systemic failures of political systems that prioritized image over reality, secrecy over safety, and royal dignity over public welfare. The cursed chambers of medieval and early modern royal marriage weren't just places where children were traumatized. They were laboratories where some of history's most dangerous political precedents were established. Modern democracies inherited many of these precedents around executive power, government secrecy, and the tension between personal privacy and public accountability. When we struggle with questions about whether political leaders should be required to disclose their medical conditions, we're still wrestling with dilemmas that first emerged in royal chambers, where syphilis-infected monarchs were making empire-shaping decisions while their brains were being consumed by bacteria. The ultimate lesson from these medical horror stories isn't just about the importance of sexual health education or the dangers of untreated disease. It's about the fundamental incompatibility between unchecked power and human accountability. The royal families who created perfect conditions for syphilis to rewrite world history were also creating political systems that remain vulnerable to similar disasters whenever power becomes too concentrated and too protected from oversight. The cursed chambers of royal Europe teach us that the most dangerous infections aren't always biological. Sometimes they're political systems that protect power from the consequences of its own corruption, allowing individual pathology to metastasize into civilizational disaster. What strikes you most about these medical secrets hidden behind centuries of royal propaganda? Do you think modern political leaders should be required to disclose health conditions that might affect their judgment? Let me know in the comments, and remember, the past has many more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and not all of them are buried as deep as the powerful would like us to believe.